Hello, good evening. Welcome to the webcast. My name is Nathan Bridges. Today we're going to be talking about the Dell custom factory integrations, and specifically I wanted to share with you as an audience how you can smoke test or test your Windows 10 SCCM task sequence using the Dell factory integrations. A lot of times you may have ordered machines from Dell and they come with a particular image. Dell has an option to install and configure the SCCM standalone media for you and run that in the factory as part of your order process. So today we're going to go over that and how you can smoke test and validate your SCCM task sequence before you submit it to the factory for your bulk orders. Let's get started. So a little bit about me. My name is Nathan Bridges. I'm founder of Modern Deployment IT blog. My goal is to provide reliable IT guides and various experiences from the field. This is one of those experiences from the field. Now, I will preface this conversation and mention as a disclaimer that the views and opinions expressed in this presentation are those of myself, and they don't reflect the official policy or position of my employer. And hopefully I don't drop F-bombs, but if I do, this is adult content, so be prepared. Also, subscribe to my channel if you get a chance, my YouTube channel, I'd appreciate it. So let's get started. All right, so the goal of this webcast rather, is to review some of the requirements. What do you need to do in your SCCM task sequence to make sure that when you submit the standalone media to the Dell factory, to the engineer, that it will install your core apps properly, it will inject drivers for the Dell hardware models, and that when you unbox it, it will have continued the task sequence, as you expect. So let's go over the agenda. The first thing we want to discuss is what exactly is configuration services, just a high-level overview. Two specific components that we're going to discuss in this webcast are the SCCM boot in factory. That will be the main demo of this webcast. And of course, there's other options for Dell Configuration Services. There's something called connected configuration, and we'll get into that. But primarily, we'll be discussing the SCCM boot in factory option. We'll also be reviewing some of the Dell SCCM boot in factory requirements. The terminology changed. It used to be known as CFI, or custom factory integration. It's now known as simply configuration services. The next agenda item that we'll actually do a demo. I'll do a demo of the configuration integrations into a Windows 10 SCCM task sequence, or the SCCM boot in factory. Show you what that looks like in a task sequence, and then show some slides. I don't have a physical machine to show, but I have taken screenshots from a physical machine that has gone through that smoke test process, so you can repeat those steps on a test machine that you have. Now, Dell normally will recommend when you create a project engagement with the CFI project manager and the CFI engineer, their instructions recommend that you use a virtual machine. You can certainly use a virtual machine, but this particular webcast that I'm going over today is about doing it on a physical machine. A lot of times I go to customer engagements, and before I leave the engagement, I want to make sure that the task sequence that I've engineered for them is actually functioning and working, so that I don't have to revisit it later. Surely I would, it's okay to help if there's a problem, but you want to make sure that everything is ready for submission. So when they submit it to the factory, it's ready to go. And doing a smoke test is a good way to do that, because it takes 3 weeks to cycle through the process of submission of an image to the factory. And so if you make a mistake and there's a problem with the join to the domain or what have you, now you have to resubmit that process all over again, and that's another 3 weeks. So that's the purpose of my webcast today, is to kind of demonstrate how you can test the process before you create the factory project with the Dell Factory Project Manager and Engineer. So the next topic we'll do, obviously, the demo, and then we'll have a recap in the next steps on what you should do next. And also we'll cover some gotchas and common troubleshooting testing that you can do as part of your smoke testing. So what's the big deal? What is Dell Configuration Services? Essentially, Configuration Services with Dell allows you to image, well, not you, but Dell, to image your Dell hardware as part of the factory process. So when they're building the machine, you submit as part of the order, you can submit an SCCM task sequence, and they basically install that SCCM task sequence using standalone media, and they process or run the task sequence up to a certain point. The machine will shut down, and when you unbox it, it will then either have some sort of network check if you add that, or a ping delay, you'll add that. You can add that to the task sequence, or some sort of GUI pop-up for naming the computer or renaming the computer, and it will resume the process, join the domain, encrypt the machine, and any other on-premise activities that you might have. The other advantage, the other big deal, is that you're able to leverage the SCCM standalone media for Windows 10 OSD. So this saves time, actually. Like I mentioned earlier, running 2/3 of your task sequence in the factory, especially if you have large application installs. Let's say, for example, it took an hour or an hour and a half to do 2/3 of your task sequence. You could have that work be done in the factory, and that will shave off a lot of time. Also, another advantage is the fact that there's when you use SCCM standalone media, there's no communication to a management point in the factory. So that speeds up the process too. The other advantage is that you're able to limit the number of OS images that you have to manage. So it's never a good idea to have to manage multiple task sequences, multiple images. You can consolidate all your logic into your task sequence for, maybe you have application personas for different business units. So you can, take advantage of that. So when you submit that standalone media and you unbox it, in theory, you could present a pop-up that installs business unit applications. Now, of course, all those applications need to be included as either app model apps or standard packages as part of that standalone media. But the goal of this is to try and save time. You're also able, like I mentioned earlier, to perform the installation of all your core apps and business unit apps that might be part of an LTI or light touch interface that you create, so that when they unbox the machine, the technician can pick additional apps, like say maybe Visio or other apps, as part of the task sequence process, and of course install your core apps such as antivirus and Office, Adobe Reader, these kind of things. So what does that look like? So essentially, you modify your current task sequence to include, the configuration requirements, and that's detailed in the document that they provide you. I'll provide that link later in the presentation. You then make sure your task sequence is configured as you want with all the requirements. You then create standalone media of your task sequence, and you send that to the Dell Configuration Services team. They will then take that media and apply it and make sure that they validate it. And what will happen as part of that step 3 right here, as part of that validation, they will send you a first article unit, is what they call it. And that first article unit from Dell will have your task sequence laid down, and basically the goal of that is to ship it to you and make sure that when you unbox it, that you have the proper experience that you expected. And that's why personally I recommend that you do a smoke test before you go through that process, because at that point, when they send you the first article back here in step 3, if there's an issue with I've had customers install applications in their SCCM app or their package where it was installing from the network. And so when they submitted it to the factory, it actually failed. It can fail the factory process. And I was able to actually catch that because I did the smoke test. And so I was wondering, why is this Office install taking 2 hours to install? Well, it was because it was timing out, and it hadn't, it obviously can't reach the network if it's in the factory. And then number 4, they'll import your standalone media into the systems that you order, and then your build is placed on systems that you've ordered and it will basically boot in the factory to launch the SCCM or the build process. And then number 6, essentially they will complete the factory build of your task sequence and the process, and then they'll shut the machine down and they will ship it either to you or directly to the user, depending on how how you want the order shipment to work. The next step is that the end user will then receive the machine. Now this could be end user, or you could, maybe you want them all shipped to the headquarters. It's more efficient if you could ship it directly to the user so that you don't have to reship to pay for, there's additional costs with that, obviously, if you have to ship it to a central location and then reship it, repackage it again. There's more work and time involved in that. And then finally, the build process continues with the steps that require network connectivity, that's local to your network. So like I mentioned earlier, domain join or BitLocker. Obviously, if you do BitLocker or MBAM, it needs to talk to your MBAM server to escrow the keys and whatnot as part of the encryption. So again, you're going to order that first article, whether it's a laptop or desktop, and make sure that it's ready and properly processed as you expected. So this is what it looks like at a high level. Your task sequence will basically have various configurations that you need to configure in your task sequence. So this example they show here, this is just like a standard task sequence. And of course, it's recommended that you have an MDT task sequence, MDT integrated task sequence in SCCM, so that you can have the additional variables and those sort of options available to you. So essentially, at certain steps of the process, you need to, in the conditions tab of the SCCM task sequence, to say, for example, in partitioning, it's required that only runs if CFI is not true, because the Dell Factory process that they run, it does the partitioning on your behalf. Now, obviously, you need to install the WEM image and the operating system. That'll run in the factory. There's steps here to import drivers. So essentially, when you order machines, you order net new machines, you don't have to worry about, that's what this Dell dynamic driver injection step is. You don't have to worry about new models and adding the drivers to the task sequence. Now, you will add the drivers to the task sequence for imaging on premise, but as it relates to the factory, you don't have to add new models to the task sequence, and the engineers are not going to add models to the task sequence. They're going to use this dynamic process here, which is a Dell CFI script, Configuration Services script, and it will dynamically inject the drivers based on the models that you order from Dell. And there's other steps in here. The most important one is down here at the bottom. So this post-delivery configuration, this is when you unbox the machine on premise. And the first thing you want to do is have either an LTI. I personally would recommend that you have an LTI above the ping delay so that you can check for the network cable and the AC power is plugged in. So for example, a lot of techs, let's say you're deploying 30,000 machines, there's going to be a percentage of techs where even I can make a mistake of not plugging the cable in, not forgetting to plug the Ethernet cable. So having a ping delay of 2 minutes or some sort of time will allow for you to connect the power, connect the Ethernet cable, and also validate that you get an IP address. I recently had an issue with this where the customer had their DHCP IP assignment took longer than 16 seconds, like you see here. So I had to change the ping delay to 2 minutes to make sure that they were getting an IP address. Otherwise, the domain join would fail when it was on premise. And then obviously that means that other steps are going to fail. So if you have encryption that needs network connectivity on the local network, those steps will obviously fail if it doesn't join the domain. And then you have to re-image the machine and you kind of fail the process essentially. The other option that Dell offers is with configuration services, something called Dell Connected Config. Now this is not the same as boot in factory as you see here. Connected Config is basically not using standalone media. It's literally a VPN tunnel, a VPN appliance that you approve, and there's a lot of security approvals and stuff you have to go through. And essentially there's a VPN tunnel between you, the customer, right, at your location, and the Dell Configuration Center, or Dell Connected Configuration Services, and these are all segmented by customers, so they're not talking to each other. I'm not going to go on this. webcast is not about those specifics, but just understand that there are other services within configuration services. I'm speaking about the technical pieces as it relates to, you know, the SCCM boot and factory. There's other services for, you know, for Dell configuration services. You know, they do rack mounting of servers, cabling, pro deploy for technicians to be on site to help if you don't have, you know, if you don't have 50 technicians, you know, there's a service from Dell where they can do pro deploy, where they can, you know, send out technicians to your location to do cabling and moving machines and that sort of stuff. So, but these is part of you know, a separate option, which allows you to basically run the task sequence in the factory. You don't have to submit media. You literally have a distribution point here in the factory, and it has a secure tunnel between you and your location and between the particular port and VLAN for that custom report for your at the Dell facility. Here's some more information about that. I would recommend that you reach out to your Dell sales tech, or sorry, excuse me, your Dell sales representative about the specifics and the technical requirements and those kind of things, and they'll get into the details on exactly what you need to do and what to expect. But essentially, you have a dedicated hardware that you're hosting, and you know specifically. That's an option, or shared virtual hosting that you can host within the Dell facility. So they can get into the specifics, and you know, like I mentioned here, there's a VPN tunnel and whatnot. But again, those are the options. So getting back to the smoke testing. So for the boot in factory process, there's specific testing requirements that we need to have in place. So I recommend normally that you have an MDT integrated task sequence, number one, for Windows 10. You know, make sure it has, you know, 1809 ADK, for example. It has the Dell WinPE drivers in the boot WIM, you know, SCCM 1902 or above with the latest hot fixes. I know a lot of customers, a lot of you out there are on older versions of SCCM. Get updated on your SCCM environment. Of course, you don't want to, it's not necessarily recommended to be on the latest and greatest of SCCM. You know, if you can, you should have a dev environment that's an SCCM dev environment that's running the latest. So for example, if 1902 is the current release now, so let's say 1905, you know, becomes production, upgrade your dev environment to the latest 1905, but keep your production environment on a previous version, you know, with the hot fixes. So, you know, that way you give time for the latest version to bake, and there's always, you know, bugs and stuff that come up with when the new release comes out for SCCM. So just make sure you have, you know, at a basic level, an MDT integrated SCCM task sequence for Windows 10. You have, you know, configured your task sequence and whatnot, and all that's working. The other recommendation I make is to create two separate custom boot images, one that disables the F8 prompt and another one that enables it. And the reason for that is it's a low probability, but it's possible that somebody can press F8, you know, if a machine flies off, you know, during shipping, and you know, gain access to the local disk during the imaging process. And that's a security concern that a lot of customers have. But you can mitigate that concern by disabling, you know, the F8 prompt with two different boot images. And then when you use the one for the CFI submission, you can disable that. And then when you need to troubleshoot, you can reference the other task sequence to troubleshoot. Now, that's just something to think about. I normally make a copy of my existing production SCCM task sequence once I get it working with Windows 10, and simply rename it at the end to -CFI R1 or something to that effect. And we'll show that in the demo. You need to run the SCCM create task sequence media wizard and make sure that you have the variable on the next to the last page that says CFI equals true. You can use Rufus or another tool to create, once the ISO is created through the SCCM console to create the media. You can use Rufus to burn that to a USB drive as part of your smoke testing, or some other scripts or something you have that will format, you know, the partitioning to UEFI. And oh, by the way, make sure that the partitioning is UEFI. Sorry, your machine needs to be UEFI based, but the partitioning needs to be GPT. And I'll provide those scripts, that sample script that you can use to do that partitioning as part of your smoke testing. So these are the two names of the scripts that I have. I have a batch file that basically partitions the drive, reading a text file, And another part of that script that runs is that it copies the Dell enterprise cab files to a particular folder, a scratch space called the T drive that gets created as part of the partitioning. It copies it there so that when you do the smoke test, you're kind of simulating what we talked about earlier, that dynamic driver injection step that runs in the factory. So you're simulating that on premise. And then the final thing you need to do as part of your test is to make sure that you disconnect the Ethernet cable before running the task sequence wizard. So when you boot with the standalone media, physically unplug the Ethernet cable, obviously leave the power cable plugged in, unplug the Ethernet cable, and run the bat file script that will do the partitioning. It will stage the drivers. And then when you run the task sequence, you're somewhat simulating what's going to happen in the factory because it's not connected. Again, we're not talking about the other servers where we talked about configuration, connected config. This is not connected config. This is basically booting factory. So it's not connected to your office, so it's not able to obviously talk to the network and that sort of thing. Okay, so make sure you unplug the Ethernet cable as part of your smoke. All right, so let's do a demo and look at what the task sequence needs to look like and what conditions you need to have at a high level. Okay, so I have my SCCM console here. Okay, so here's the task sequence I have. Let's have a look at that. Okay, maximize that. So you create an MDT integrated task sequence, and I've got a lot of steps in here, just as an example. So let's look as an example. So for anything partitioning related, as you noticed in that screenshot earlier in the instructions, one of the steps here is to make sure that CFI is not equals true for that particular step, as you notice here. Okay? Close this in. Oh, I did view and not edit, that's why. Okay, so you edit your task sequence. All right, there we go. And make sure you have these conditions at certain points. Now, another important section in the MDT integrated task sequence is the new computers group. Also make sure that that doesn't run because we don't want to partition the drive or any of that kind of stuff. Okay, here's a good example. During the applied drivers step or group that you have, it's important that that also is set to CFI not equals true. And what I normally do is when I make a copy of the task sequence in preparation for my smoke test, I either will come in here and disable this or simply delete it from the copy that you make, right? So just delete it from there, and that way when you run the wizard, the SCCM task sequence media wizard, it just flat won't have that content in it, and that just makes your ISO a lot smaller. So CFI not equals true rather needs to be set for conditions and steps where you don't want that step or group to run in the factory. Now, here's what we were talking about, the factory integration as far as the driver injection. You simply add this step, add it literally right before the setup Windows and ConfigMgr step, okay? Right in this is the PE phase, and also make sure that that step is, continue on error, and this is all in the instructions that we'll show here later. And I'll reference that in the document later. But CFI equals true, so we do want this to run in the factory, right? There's certain requirements where we do want it to run in the factory. Now these steps here, the out-of-box setup Windows and ConfigMgr, there is a known problem that if you have a fallback status point, you cannot define a fallback status point in the factory. It will actually fail the factory testing process because obviously, again, you're not connected to your network. So it's this step, when you have this fallback status point defined here, it's actually trying to talk to the fallback status point back in your home domain, and that's going to fail. So you can set two different steps here, or just not define a fallback status point if you don't want to. So here's an example of another one where I want it to be true. CFI is true, and you notice there's no fallback status point defined here. It's just DNS suffix and the caching size and whatnot. Another gotcha here is to make sure that after the state restore step or after the setup Windows and ConfigMgr step, do not delete this restart computer option. What will happen is if you do delete this in your task sequence, it will run this step, reboot out of Windows PE, and the first time it attempts to boot to Windows, it will just simply go to the it will be in workgroup, of course, and it won't continue the task sequence. So you need to have this restart step here, and then you can add other steps in here that you need for various things. Okay, so the next important part of the task sequence is this group right here, Dell CS integration. This is all in documentation again, and you need to have the condition set here like that. CFI is true. So when you run this on premise, it's not going to run this group. It's going to skip these steps. Now, so remember I mentioned earlier that basically all these steps here, all these steps are going to run in the factory. So all your install applications, install packages, all your core apps you would put under here, for example. So if laptop, if desktop, etc. And then everything from this point down is going to run when it unboxes the machine. Okay? So for this example, I actually have a group that I created for CFI is true. So when it unboxes, it will run the UDI page so that they can check the AC cable and the network cable, and it'll run a script to rename the computer, right? Joins it to the domain based on what they pick in the UDI wizard. So you could have your own LTI. I know a lot of people use UI++ and other great LTIs that you can use. You just plug that in when you need to plug it in. Just make sure that it's after the post delivery phase of the task sequence. Okay, so when you unbox it, that it processes properly. And then of course you got all your customizations, all your other steps, language packs, etc. And at the very end of your task sequence, you need to have this step here to do the CFI cleanup. And again, this is only going to run if CFI is true, otherwise it's going to skip it. Okay, that's really it as far as the SCCM task sequence. Now, to create the media, so you're going to, let's pretend this is my task sequence that I want to do my smoke test with. Normally when you submit to the factory, you need to check this box. So if you're familiar with running the task sequence, when it boots to PE, it has that task sequence wizard, right? When you submit to the factory, check this box, right? But when you're doing the smoke test, leave this unchecked. Okay, use standalone media. We're going to pick unlimited because a lot of times your ISO file is going to be really large. So what I do is I copy the path on where you want it to go, okay, /, and I will include in the name of the ISO the actual name of the task sequence. So do like I mentioned earlier, that's CFI smoke test R1. So maybe you're doing it multiple times a day, .iso. Okay, you can label it. This is a new feature. These two options here are new features in SCCM 1902, by the way. So you could label this CFI smoke test R1. Okay, then unlimited, we got that right. Next, we don't want to put a password on this. And when you submit to the factory, you can't have a password. Again, when it runs in the factory, it has to be zero touch. It can't be LTIs popping up during the factory process. When you are in the post-delivery phase, it's okay if you want to have pop-ups and LTIs and what have you. Pick your task sequence that you're going to use for smoke testing. Hit next. Okay, I don't have applications in my task sequence, but it's a good idea to use app model apps and not packages. Okay. I disabled. Notice in my test, I disabled the smoke test. Sorry, excuse me. I disabled the drivers group because we're going to use the partitioning script, which is going to stage the extracted cap files for the particular model you're testing with to the scratch space T drive partition that gets created from that script, from that partitioning script. So hit next here. Okay, now this is really important. This page here is where you put CFI equals true. So if you remember from all of those steps we had in the task sequence where it was CFI true, CFI not equals true, this is how it's able to process that particular logic, right? So we get a summary and then we hit next. Now I'm not going to hit next because I don't have an actual physical machine as part of this webcast. But you would hit next, it'll build the ISO. You then use Rufus to burn that ISO to your media, and then you physically are able to test with that model. All right, back to our presentation. So make sure you have CFI is true on that. Now, when you boot, so basically you will use Rufus. Let's go back here. Here, you will use Rufus to burn that ISO that you create with the Media Wizard. You will then copy these files, this CMD file and this text file, to the root of the drive. You will then also create a folder on the root of your USB drive where you burn the standalone media. You'll create a folder called Dell Driver, Dell Driver is one word. And for, let's say it's a Lenovo, let's say it's a Dell Latitude 7490. Go download the enterprise cabs from here. It'll be a .cab file, right? So use 7-zip and extract it to this directory, okay? Delete the x86 folder out of there, and then when you run the task sequence, it'll run that step here. So the first thing you do is hit F8, boot with that standalone media. You'll press F8. You'll then run this, bat file command. So you need to navigate to it. It's more than likely going to be D or E drive letter for the USB drive that you have attached. Run it from the root of the drive, right? It's going to partition. Don't hit next on the task sequence wizard, okay? It's going to run that script, do the partitioning, and then it's going to quickly start, it's going to create a partition for a scratch base so that we can test the driver, the dynamic driver injection, right? So that's going to run here. Don't worry about that T drive after the fact. You're just doing this for testing purposes. When you do this submission in the factory, that scratch space won't exist. That T drive, any sort of scratch space, it'll be deleted, it'll be cleaned up. The partitioning will just be C, right, for Windows 10. So then when that script is finished running, then you can, when it's successfully finished, you can close that command prompt window, hit next, multiple times. Again, make sure you disconnect the Ethernet cable before hitting next so that we're simulating what's going to happen in the factory, right? Now, obviously, it's not talking to a management point when he's using standalone media, but, we're trying to simulate or test the, on a physical machine, we're trying to test your task sequence in this manner. So make sure you have Ethernet cable disconnected. Okay, here's where the dynamic driver, so it runs the task sequence, it formats it, it applies the WIM, then it starts doing this step here. Here's where we ran the script earlier, right, where we staged the drivers. It will then start staging those drivers that you extracted from the enterprise cab to this scratch space that from this script here that ran earlier, right here, right? Sense? Okay. Now, so then, like I said earlier, it'll start, laying down your custom WIM. When it reboots out of PE, it will then boot back to the task sequence and start installing Office and all the other steps you have. And again, all of those steps are going to run in the factory. Okay. Then what happens is now you're in the post-delivery phase. So this is the point where the end user or the technician or you receive all the machines, you unbox them. And in this example, I'm using a custom UDI page where I check for, and this is built into the MDT integrated task sequence, by the way. You can create a UDI page and just check for a wired connection and AC power. Now, this will not check for an IP address or any of that, which is why you need the ping delay. Okay, so like I mentioned recently, I had a customer and their DHCP IP assignment was taking longer than 16 seconds, which is the default that Dell recommends in the factory instructions for this. So make sure you test this to make sure that, because it can happen intermittently, right? So just make sure, personally, I would recommend that you just put a ping loop like this for 60 seconds or 2 minutes, just to be safe. Also, if you have network access controls as a customer, where you're doing security blocking and checking on at the physical layer, and you're managing devices based on MAC address, make sure that these MAC addresses for all your new machines are added to the exception list for your NAC policy. Otherwise, you'll unbox the machine and it will simply be blocked. It won't get it won't get a green check mark for the wired connection. And by the way, once you plug the cable in and you hit the retry checks here, it should look like this. Okay, again, but this doesn't mean that you have an IP address. It just simply means that the network port is live. There's a connection that it detects. Okay, so the task sequence continues, and that's really it. So to recap, basically make sure your task sequence has the logic to do CFI is true or not true, during the wizard like we showed. Validate all of your SCCM packages and apps and make sure that they have silent installs. They're not trying to, install from a network location or copy files to a network location or any of that, because again, this is running in the factory. And then the next steps is work with your Dell sales point of contact on how you can create a factory. You basically need to create a project for this. And again, that's a 3-week project. And they will work with you and assign you a project, a project manager and a CFI engineer, and they will essentially work with you to make sure your task sequence that you submit, your standalone media, that is properly configured. And then, like I mentioned earlier, when you're testing, your smoke testing, you make sure you do you uncheck the don't allow unattended box when you run the media creation wizard, but make sure that you check it when you actually submit to the factory. Okay, and I'll always make sure you have CFI is true as the value as well. Some of the troubleshooting things that you make sure you account for. Always make sure your domain join service account has the proper permissions. I'm going to link a reference to my blog post on how the actual screenshots on setting those permissions properly. Make sure you add the proper conditional steps on certain groups, such as partitioning and any sort of on-premise LTIs that you have popping up for a computer name or what have you. Make sure they have CFI is true or not true. Where applicable, make sure you package all your apps and that they're installing silently. They're not popping up any sort of windows, or sometimes you have an installation and it pops up a window, and you just got to make sure you package all your apps and packages correctly without any interaction, unattended basically. Add a ping loop where you need to when you do in the post delivery phase. That can be good to make sure that you have an IP address or give enough time to get an IP address. Otherwise, the domain join could fail. And I've seen that recently, where the domain join process has basically failed during my smoke test because it was not able to get an IP address quick enough in time for the domain join step to work. Use other GUIs out there, other LTIs, UI++ or other PowerShell scripts you can use to check for a network connection, to check for AC power. I personally would just use UDI custom page. That works pretty good, and just have those 2 pages. That works fine. Use a known good USB flash media when you're doing your smoke testing. I recommend using SanDisk Extreme. They have high read and write speeds. Time is money, right? So if your ISO for your standalone media is 20 gigs and you have a super slow USB drive that you're testing with, it's going to take multiple hours for it to write to it and extract it and all of this stuff. So just pay $20, $30 for a faster speed drive, and it doesn't have to be SanDisk, whatever drive that's got a higher or fast read and write speeds. Make sure that Rufus is not being blocked by any security tools or host intrusion apps. It shouldn't, in my experience, I haven't been blocked too much, but in some cases it is blocked. So you might have to use other scripts to do the GPT partitioning and to extract the ISO content so that to make sure that it's bootable. So here's some references to the different articles I talked about. So Configuration Services, this is the home page for all things related to factory services and imaging, and here's the white paper. If you go to this white paper and look at it, that link, it'll look like this. So these are the steps from the factory engineers. You read through this, make sure you understand it. Another thing too, don't use auto apply drivers. Use the apply driver step for your on-premise task sequence. But again, when you're doing the smoke test and when you do CFI submission, you can simply disable that step, because as long as you have the dynamic driver the Dell dynamic driver injection included in your task sequence, you should be good. You shouldn't have to worry about that. So again, like here, Make sure you have the Dell Dynamic Driver Injection step so you don't have to worry about driver injection in the factory. Okay. Any sort of all your additional steps when you unbox, again, they need to go in after the post-delivery configuration phase. And just, take your time and go through this document. Make sure your partitioning steps are set to CFI not equals true so that they don't process in the factory, because it's going to fail in the factory process if you do have them incorrectly configured. And they've got additional information here. They do recommend that you create standalone media and test it on a virtual machine. So my webcast here is talking about testing it on a physical machine, a physical Dell machine. Okay. BitLocker, you don't have to worry about BitLocker with Windows 10 because it automatically has the GPT partitioning and whatnot. So this is really not applicable for Windows 10 with GPT partitioning. And that's really it on the document. Just take your time, go through the document, make sure you understand it, work with your CFI engineer. Okay, and that's really it. So I appreciate your time. If you have questions, reach out to me, give comments on the YouTube channel here, and subscribe. I appreciate your time, and I hope this was helpful to you. I'll look forward to seeing you next time.